Tonight's Central New England wood turning demonstration is going to be a project to make wooden stems for wine glasses. Normally I make these in pairs, but I've only shown 3 types of glasses here. On this side we have a pair of champagne glasses where the base and stems are made out of 2 different types of rosewood. This glass here has a base and stem made out of bloodwood, and the base and stem on this glass is made out of olive wood. And I want to focus on the bottom of the glass at first, and as you can see here, there's a central indentation that was cut with a Forstner bit that was used to hold the wood onto the lathe. Now, to make that a little bit less obvious, I've turned out the central spur of the Forstner bit here, and then added a series of 3 concentric circles around it to give it a little bit of decoration. Now, the base of the wine glass also has 3 levels to give it a little bit of decoration. The stem is tapered so that it's narrowest in the center. It flares out to hold the glass. There's an additional detail here and one down at the bottom. Now the wine glasses are made using 2 different pieces of wood. The bottom of the wine glass has the wood with the grain running parallel to the table. The reason for doing that is if the wood if one makes the whole piece out of end grain, the bottom is prone to cracking when it's this thin. The stem, on the other hand, has to be made with the grain in the opposite direction, otherwise the stem will crack. And so I'm going to show you how we're going to combine the 2 pieces of wood and then hide the junction so it's not obvious. Okay, these are the starting materials to make the base and stem. Normally I use exotic woods to make the glasses look more interesting, but today I'm just going to be using cherry for both the base and the stem. Now, you don't really need to use the same wood for both. Some glasses look quite nice when you use contrasting base and stem pieces. Now, the base blank is 2 3/4 inches across. The final diameter is going to be right at 2 3/4 inches. The wood is 3/4 inch thick, which gives you plenty of room for gluing and the tenon in the back. The stem blank is 1 inch cross section and 3.5 inches long. The choice of the length is such that the final wine glass is going to be roughly the same height as the glass we're starting with. And so first I'm going to score some marks here with a scribe to find the center of this block, and then use a center punch, which I got at Harvard Freight Sales, to put a dimple at the center. I'll eventually score center position on the stem blank also. Now the glasses are relatively inexpensive. We have gotten them in the past from either Target or Ocean State Job Lot in sets of 8. Now, to remove the stem, we have to score the glass with a 3-corner file right beneath the dimple here, where the flare ends. And so we want to get a good score mark to make sure that the glass snaps off. I'm going to bring a trash can up to catch the broken glass, and then give a good whack to the side of the stem. And that broke off fairly cleanly. So far what I've done is go over to the bandsaw and knock the corners off the square block after having drawn a line that hit the edges. And so I'm going to be using a friction drive to further round that out. Now the components of the friction drive are a hub that goes onto the lathe and then a face plate. These were sold by Craft Supplies about 10 years ago, but it seems to be a discontinued item, which is unfortunate. And so I just attached one of those face plates with a waste block on it, and to that I've super glued some plumbing gasket. The plumbing gasket comes in sheets like this. It's about 6 inches square and it's about 1/16 inch thick, and so this will serve as a friction drive when I'm rounding the base portion. We're now ready to round this base section out. So I just bring up the tailstock going into the center punched hole I made earlier and bring up the tailstock. I'm going to be using a bowl gouge to round the piece at least an inch. So I've now got the piece rounded, and this is a sizing gauge because I'm going for 2 3/4 inches, and you can see it doesn't fit on yet, so the piece needs to come smaller. It's fairly close now, but I'm going to reduce the size a bit more. Okay, that's a good 2 3/4 inch size. So the next thing I need to do is to form a tenon on one side so I can hold it with a chuck. I'll be using a spindle gouge to do that. So there's the tenon. So now I'm going to be putting a chuck on the lathe to hold the base with the tenon. This is now going to be the very bottom of the base for the wine glass. And so the first thing to do is to clean up that bottom and put a slight taper so that when the glass sits on a table, it's going to be setting up on the outer edge of the piece. Okay, that looks good. I've got the slate taper. Now I'm going to use drill a hole, which is eventually going to hold this base on when the rest of the wine glass is made. And so what I'm going to be using is a 2-inch diameter Forstner bit, and the hole that I'm going to be drilling is going to be roughly 1/8 inch deep. So I turn the speed on the lathe down so that we're not going too fast for the Forstner bit. We'll be going at about 450 RPM. Drilling step is complete. It's the hole that I drilled is about 1/8 inch deep. At this point, what I'm going to do is try to disguise that a little bit by turning a dimple in the setter to take attention away from where the setter bit of the setter spur of the Forstner bit cut a deeper hole. And so I'm just going to do that with a spindle gouge, increasing the lathe speed. Use a small scraper. Now I'm going to make a series of grooves in that, concentric grooves with a small skew chisel, which I'm just going to use the very point to do the cutting. Now I want to chamfer what's going to be the bottom, and I'm just going to do that with the full gouge. At this point, the bottom would be ready to sand. I'm not going to sit here and sand and have you watch sanding, so we're just going to go on to the next step. At this point, we have to change chucks to use one that fits that 2-inch diameter when the jaws are in expansion mode. Okay, I've changed chucks on the lathe to a chuck that's made by Penn State Industries. It's called the Barracuda Chuck, and it's got the large jaws for it, which has a diameter of just under 2 inches when in expansion mode. So now I've got the piece attached to that chuck. And so now the next step is to clean up the face that we're going to eventually glue the stem to. And so earlier I had scored scratches to find the setter, and so those scratches now need to be removed before we can do the gluing step, or the scratches will end up in the final wine glass. I can still see one scratch, so we need to go a little bit further. Checking the surface just with the side of a parting tool to see that there aren't lumps and bumps. At this point it looks pretty good. The next step is to drill a 1/2 inch diameter hole that's about 3/8 inch deep. Okay, I want to drill a hole about 3/8 inch deep. That's deep enough to be a good mounting position for the stem blank, but not so deep that I risk having the hole go through the bottom of the wine glass base. And so I need to go a little bit deeper. We can measure that with a caliper, and it's about 1/64 of an inch short of 3/8 inch deep. So that's good. And so now I'm going to round out the stem blank. Between centers using the holes that I marked earlier. For this, I'll be using a spindle roughing gouge. By putting the roughing gouge on top while the piece is spinning, I can tell whether I've gotten the points off. It sounds pretty good. Yeah, it's all rounded. I've changed chucks again. In this case, I now have a one-way chuck with number 1 jaws that can grasp the stem blank. Now I'm going to make a mark on the stem blank so that I know how deep to make the tenon that's going to fit into the base blank. And so I'd measured that hole earlier, and it was just short of 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to plan on getting a little bit over 5/6 of an inch long tenon. And so I've got the marking gauge up here. I draw a line on the piece. bring up my tailstock. Now with the pencil lying on the tool rest, I'm just going to extend that line so that I can see it when it spins. I'm going to score that with a skew chisel. Score mark looks good. Now I'm going to bring that down to 1/2 inch. It's about 1/16 inch too big at this point. About a 32nd inch too big. Now it's time to start testing it. Doesn't fit yet, but it's getting close. Like to sneak up on these final diameters so that the fit is nice and snug once you get some glue into it. Okay, that fits well. Now it's time to check the fit between the base blank and the stem blank. Not only does the diameter of the tenon have to be allow a smooth fit into the base, but it's very important that the shoulders of the stem blank are perpendicular to the lathe bed. That is, they neither flare out or flare in. If they flare out such that you'll be able to see a gap between the base blank and the stem blank. If they flare in, you'll have a glue pocket there which might get exposed when we turn the stem and base together. So I'm putting that in, and you can see that there's no light gap coming between the stem blank and the base blank. So this these two parts are now ready for the glue up. I've now got the base onto the Penn State Industries chuck, and I've set it so that the grain lines one can see on the cherry are in a vertical position. I'm now going to take some Tight Bond 2, apply that to the tenon, place that into the base with the visible lines also again in the vertical position. I bring up the tailstock, apply pressure, and wipe off the excess glue. Now I'm going to let that dry overnight, and it'll be ready to work on the next day. Well, the glue is now dried. The first thing I'm now going to do is true up this portion of the stem blank to make sure that when I start forming the cup that is going to hold the glass, that it's all round. I'll just do a few passes with a spindle gouge over that, and everything looks good now. So the next thing I have to do is think about making a recess that is going to hold the wine glass. So here's the wine glass that I broke yesterday. If I take a measurement across the bottom part of the stem that's still there, that's just slightly over 1/2 inch in diameter. The piece of glass that's left over from the stem is also about 1/2 inch deep. And so what I'm going to do now is use a 1/2 inch Forstner bit to drill a hole that's going to start the cup to hold the wine glass. And I'm going to drill it roughly 1/2 inch deep. Now it's not, I've only gotten to about 3/8 inch deep now, so I'm going to go a little bit deeper. That looks good. So now if we bring up the glass to the hole that I just drilled, it only fits in about a 32nd of an inch because the glass flares from the thinnest point, and by the time you get up to the thicker point where it has to be inside the stem, it's up to about 3/4 of an inch across. And so now this hole needs to be flared to allow the glass to fit. And so I'm going to do that flaring with a scraper. I've started opening up the hole, and we've repositioned the camera so that you can see what I'm doing better. Now I'm going to stop the lathe and do a test fit of the glass. And while the glass certainly goes in farther than it did previously, it's still not up to the point where the broken stem fits easily into the wood. So I'm going to go back and make the walls here thinner. It's always difficult when trying to fit a curved object into a hole to decide which portion of the arrow you're expanding is the one that's not allowing the glass to go deeper. Okay, now it's gotten to the point where it looks like what it's supposed to. The wooden stem is now touching the shoulder of the glass at the point where the stem is just shifting into the globe. And so I'm satisfied with the hole I've got. Now that the opening for the wine glass has been formed, that's going to serve a second function, which is we can put the live center into that, which will now allow us to take more aggressive cuts on the turning of the stem and base. Now the first thing I want to do is make a little chamfer up there at the top, and so I'm just going to take a spindle gouge and make a little angle in towards the cup that holds the wine glass. At this point I'm going to switch over to spindle roughing gouge to get rid of some excess stock on the stem. Now, while that's not the final thickness of the stem, I do want to make a mark at this point, which is to put a little line 1/2 inch deep down from the top, which is going to mark the bottom depth of the drill hole I drew. Because I want to keep in mind that the area above that is hollow, and if I go too deep I will simply ruin the piece. And so that line is just to remind me for later. We're not to the final thickness there, but I am going to start now shaping the base because there's a lot of stock to remove there also. So I like the bottom part of the glass to be 3/16 of an inch thick so that it doesn't look too thick and is similar to the thickness of a regular wine glass. Now, if you remember from the images that I showed earlier of the finished product, there were 3 concentric steps going up the side of the base to provide extra interest. And I mentioned earlier that I was going to show you how I was going to hide the joint between the stem and the base. Now, the method of hiding the joint between the stem and the base is to actually have that at the point where 2 steps merge, a step between the stem and the base merges, and I'll show you what I mean by that later. So the next thing to do is start removing additional material from the base. And so I'm going to measure the dimensions of that first step I've made. It's right around 2 inches, which is about like what I like to have it be at. I should mention that when you're making glasses, pairs of glasses like this, the first one takes about half as long to make as the second one, because while you're making the second one, you're trying to make sure that each curve and each step on the second glass is at exactly the same point it was on the first glass, so they look like they're a true pair of wine glasses. So now it's time to put in a second step. And now it's time to hide the junction between the stem and the base. I'm going to stop and look at those circles and see if there are ragged edges, and what I can see is that I need to do a little trimming, particularly on the second step where there's a residue of wood fibers. The next thing I can see is that this indentation between the upper and lower, the base and the stem, is about 1/32 of an inch too high at this point. So instead of hiding the junction appears at the top of the base element. So that part needs to be recut. Okay, I've gotten out a different spindle gouge, a detail gouge that has a sharper point so that I can get down into that junction without having the tool hit both sides of the wood. now going to use a scraper on those shelves because those were uphill cuts. They're a little bit rough. I still don't quite have the junction where I want it to be between the base and the stem, so a little bit more wood needs to be removed there. Now I'm going to work more on shaping the stem and making it narrower. I don't know if you can see this, but I've added an extra step near the top, and the purpose of that is to allow me to keep the thickness that's wider than the hole I had drilled. In the end, I want to make the stem roughly a 1/4 inch thick. So there's definitely more wood to remove here, but it's getting closer. I'm to a final dimension and shape, so I'm just going to run a skew chisel over the stem to get it as smooth as possible, so to minimize sanding. If I take a caliper, I can see that I'm about 5/16 there in the center. But overall, I like the shape of the stem, and it's what I was trying to achieve. There's still some minor bits of extra cleanup to do here. Also want to round the bottom of the base a little bit. Just do that with the scraper. At this point, this piece is now ready for sanding. I'm not going to make a second one to show you how one makes them similar in shape, but the key is to take measurements so that when you do the second one you can try to match. So for example, the distance between the top of the cup and that first step came out at 3/8 of an inch. The center was about 5/16. This is about 3/16. The first ring is at 2. The second ring is at 1 3/8. The third ring is just over 1, and the bottom of the stem is at 11/16. So taking those sorts of measurements, you can then attempt to get a second base and stem that appears to be identical. So we can now take the wine glass off the lathe. This is what it looks like. This is without any sanding. The overall thickness there is still enough to prevent that from breaking when the wine glass is in. So if this was going to become a real wine glass, my next step would be to, after sanding, would be to start adding finish. The finish that I typically use on these is water locks, because that gives a nice hard finish that will be compatible with people holding the piece in their hands. Another finish one could use, but I haven't tried, would be a wipe-on poly for a glass like this. And so in the next short clip, I will be showing you how we attach a glass to a base when it's finished. So for many years when making these glasses, I was using the adhesive goop to glue the glass into the stem. This last fall, when I went to glue the glasses, I discovered that my tube of goop had solidified, so I went down to the hardware store, got a new tube of goop, and tried gluing these glasses up, and the material really was setting very slow, and the glasses were sort of tipping over, and then I'd put them back straight. And so this particular glass, when it was the glass tilted off after I'd quit watching it, and so this was going to be an unusable glass. I was able to get the glass out. We went to the Craft Supplies website, who sells glasses for making wine glasses, and looked up their procedure, and they recommended using epoxy. So we're going to make up some 5-minute epoxy, come back and do this glue up. I neglected to mention when I was discussing finish that you want to have the finish on the outside, but you don't want finish in the cup. I've added some epoxy now, so we're getting that on. I'm getting that onto the lathe. I'm going to place the glass in position and then bring up the tailstock, which has a large center that will allow the glass to be pushed against the Obviously, I don't want to push too hard and crack the glass. I can see that I've had a little bit of squeeze out here. I'm going to try to remove that now, but any squeeze out that I can't get out now, I can remove later. And so I'll now let that go for several hours, and the glass should be attached.